Hello everyone, welcome to everyone who is joining this live stream. Today we're going to be going over a little bit more in depth with the timeline, and we're going to be using a couple of scripts to be able to control different types of timelines. Now this is going to be more specific to an in-game environment where we are going to be going through starting off with a sequence, and then we are going to go into a playable part where we can actually control the character around. So I do have a new character in here that we're going to be playing around as, and then we're going to trigger a second sequence. So the second sequence is going to be a robot character that's going to be just walking around down the hallway of one of the hallways in this level. So if you have any questions, let me know in the chat. I will be checking chat occasionally. If you have any questions about Unity or the timeline or anything that we're covering in this live stream, let me know. So welcome everyone to this live stream. I'm going to get started by first going over the completed version of this. This did take me a few hours to actually put together because there were a few quirks with the timeline and how it works. So I'm going to be going over the completed version of what we're going to be attempting to recreate here. We are going to be recreating the scripts, and we're also going to be going over recreating the same timeline sequences, but I want to show you the completed version first. So let me go and switch to Unity now. Okay, so I'm going to actually, I'll leave this open for now, and I'll take a look at the timeline. So I have two different timelines in here. I have one that's starting off. So we're going to be starting with this timeline, and then we're going to have a second timeline, which is going to be essentially called or enabled through a trigger. So I do have this set up already. The first timeline is going to start on awake. The second timeline is not set to start on awake. Instead, we're going to be using a custom script, and this is going to be for our robot character. So I'm going to go ahead and maximize this. So it is set to maximize on play. And then I'm going to hit play. Okay, so we're starting off with the character, our playable character on the floor. We have our camera panning up. We have one animation of him getting up off the floor. Then the second camera is looking at him from behind where his second animation plays. Okay, and then we're going to jump into a playable sequence. Oh, and I forgot, let's see. I forgot to turn on the simple controller when that happens. Let's give this another quick try. Okay, so he turned for some reason. I think that's because I removed a script. But he's getting up off the ground. We're panning up to look at him. We have a different camera view. And then once that finishes, now our sequence is done. And now I can start walking around, and I'm actually controlling this player now. So we went from an event, a timeline sequence, and right here there's going to be a event. So here we have a second timeline sequence playing. I don't know if you guys can hear the footsteps of the robot, but this robot is being animated through the timeline. So he goes down this hallway area, and then he just stops and goes into an idle state. So this second timeline is not based off cameras. It just has an animation of this robot character playing. Then he just stops right here. Okay, so relatively simple, but it is going to take some work to actually create. So we're going to be recreating this ourselves. So I'm going to start off in an empty scene. We do have the character already created, but I am going to be adding scripts to him. And I'm also going to be adding the robot characters and the animations that we're going to be using. So I'm going to jump into that new scene. Okay, and I'm going to have my scene window open on the left and the game window open on the right, just so I can see what the camera is actually looking at. And also I can easily move around in this environment. I also have the timeline opened up, and we're going to start off by creating a timeline manager. So the first timeline is going to be an empty game object. This will be our starting timeline, and we're going to have this starting right when we hit play. So I'll create an empty game object in my hierarchy, and I'll name it timeline start. And I'm going to create a director component and the timeline asset from this. Now when I create this, it's also going to add an animator component to this. For some reason, it adds an animation track whenever you first create this. We're then going to remove that. So I'm going to go ahead and create this. I'm going to remove timeline at the very end here. So it's just timeline start. And I'm going to save this in my timelines folder. So I do have a starting folder for this. Okay, and like I mentioned before, it's going to add an animator. We don't need the animator, but since it adds an animation track, we need an animator for this. I don't need this. I'm not going to be animating the actual empty game object, so I can delete that. And since we don't need that track, I can then remove the animator, or actually just turn it off. It doesn't really matter. So now what I want to do is I want to add in my first human character, which is this guy that we see in here. Now I did have this guy already set up with a couple of scripts that we're going to be using for controlling him. So we have a character controller and a simple controller. This will allow me to actually move around in our environment. And the human character, when I imported this has animations. These animations come from Mixamo. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but Mixamo has a bunch of different animations. So I'm going to be using animations with this character. We're going to be using a total of 2 animations with this character. So he has an animator. We want to animate this character, but we're going to be using pre-made animations that were created externally outside of Unity. So let's go and create our first animation. I'm going to select the timeline start. Let's go to add animation track. Okay, it's looking for an animator. And we'll add the human. Okay, there we go. Now, there was a bit of an issue that I had with this before. So if you are using this and you encounter this issue, this is why. So before, when I tried to add a human character like this to the timeline, if that character has a humanoid rig, I had an issue where the character kept getting transported over here. And it only happened when I added him to the timeline. Now, I know it's an issue with the rig type because when I tried this with the robot character, it also did the same thing. Now, the robot character in our current scene is set as a generic type, so it doesn't have this issue anymore. Now, if you are using a humanoid type, then you have to use an empty game object as the parent. I found that this did resolve that issue. So hence why we have the human player here, and then we have an empty game object which has our scripts in here. So just be aware of that if you do experience that issue. Let's go back to our timeline. And right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a couple of animation clips. So we can either record an animation just like before in our first live stream, or we can also add animation clips to this. So I do have the animation clips ready to go. So in my models folder, animations, I have a number of different animations in here. I did want to make this a little bit larger, but it was a bit time consuming and I did run into a few issues. So I'm going to make this quite simple with a few animations to start. So the first one is going to be of him standing up. So this animation starts off with him on the ground, and when we hit play, he's just going to get up off the ground. Now the second animation is going to be of him looking around. So it's this one right here. And the materials on this preview here are see-through at the moment. But you can see he's basically just looking around. And we're going to be blending between these 2 different animations. So the first one is going to be our standing up. And to add that to our timeline, we need to open this up. And we just have to drag the animation clip into this track. Okay, so now you can see that in our preview here, we're starting off with our character on the ground. And if I scrub through this, you can see it plays just fine. Okay, now after this first animation, I then want to add in my second animation, which is of him looking around. So let's go into looking around. Oh, it's actually look around. I have 2 different look animations. So it's this one right here where he's just kind of looking at his hands. Now, when we add in a second animation clip, you can see that I can basically butt this up against each other. And if I just do that, we're going to get a very rough cut between these 2. So it basically has a jump cut between these 2 animations. If we want to blend between these 2, what we do is hold this and drag it in to the second animation clip. And you can see we get this line here. This lets us know that we're blending between these 2 animations. So now we can see that we get some nice blending here. And there we go. So after that animation clip has finished playing, or rather when we're playing these animation clips, I also want to have my cameras moving in a certain direction. So I want to have a camera in front of this player. Right about here or so. So from the preview, we had the first camera relatively close to him, right about here or so. Trying to get a better view here. Right about here or so. And then as he's coming up, as we're going through the animation of him standing up, we want the camera to actually pan up and go with him as well. Now we're going to have two different cameras for this, and I want to have a cameras group. So I'm going to create a cameras group in our hierarchy. Let's right click in here, create empty, and this will be camera group. Hello Victor. Hello everyone else that's just joining. So I'm going to add in a couple of cameras here. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to go down to camera. And I'm going to place it right here. So an easy way to place this camera in this particular view is to select the camera, go to game object, align with view. Okay, and let's see, let's take a look at this from the timeline. I probably need to move that camera, but what I want to do is I want to add in a couple more tracks for both the cameras that I want to use. So I'm going to duplicate this camera. This one will be called first cam. And the second one will be called second cam. Now both of these are going to be animated, so we need to include animators for these. So I'll select both of these and we'll go to add components, animator. Okay, so we have an animator now, and now we can start animating these cameras. I'm going to add in a animation track for both these cameras. Let me take a quick swig of water. Okay, so I'm going to add the first cam in here and the second cam underneath it. So for the first cam, let's see if we get a better view here. So for the first cam, I want it to start off maybe about right here. And I'm trying to line this up. It's a little bit too erratic here. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and select that first camera. Go to game object, align with view. Let's go back to our timeline. So we're starting off right about here. That's probably a little bit too high. I'm going to turn off the second camera as well because it could cause some confusion. They're both basically in the exact same area. So I'll turn this off for now, just so we see exactly what we see from our first cam. And I don't think this one will cause an issue, but I'll turn this off for now as well. Jump back into our timeline. Okay, so this is what our first cam is looking at. And now I'm going to record this. So I'm going to click on the record button. I'll add in my first keyframe. So the first keyframe that I want to add in is the position, making sure that I have the camera selected. So I'm going to drop it down just slightly, just a bit, until it adds that first keyframe. Okay, so we can see the little diamond there. That is our first keyframe. Hello, Andrew. So that is our first keyframe. Now what I want to do is I want to have this pushed in. So I want to move the camera inward and also move it up as well to match the animation of him standing up. So we'll scroll through this, and I'm going to change the timeline here to read in seconds. It's going to be a little bit easier to read instead of frames. Okay, so let's see. Probably about 7 seconds in is where I want to start panning upward. So let's make sure that we're at exactly 7. Okay, and if you want to make sure that it is exactly at 7, you can also type it in right here. So you can see right here it says 7. And this is where I'm going to add in my second keyframe. So I want to push this in a bit and then also move it up. Okay, so that seems to be working, and it may be, I may need to push it out a bit. You can see that it kind of cuts him off a little bit too much right there. So what I'll do is at 7, make sure we're exactly at 7. I'll move it out a bit. Okay. That'll work fine. I mean, it still kind of cuts him off right here, but once he starts getting up, it's in a good position there. And then maybe at the 9-second mark, I'll move it in a little bit closer as well. I don't know why it jumped like that. Go back to 9 seconds. I'll move it in again. Maybe move it up a bit. Okay, then I'll add in a second keyframe right here, right where it starts to blend, or right when this first animation stops. That's when we're going to start including a second camera. Now, we could add in a activation track because I want to turn off the first camera, but we can also do this through animation. Now, what I can do is actually turn off the camera components. So if I check this off, you can see it turns red. Anytime you see any kind of red in here, this lets us know that there's some sort of keyframe attached to that. Now, the problem is that if we don't have a keyframe before that stating that this was checked on, it's going to stay off through the entire animation. So right at the beginning, I'm going to add in a keyframe for that as well to keep it on. So that way it stays on, and then at the very end, it turns off. Okay, so right at this point, we're going to transition into our second camera. So I'm going to turn on that second camera now, and I'll just turn off the first one. Oh, and I need to make sure, so I'm going to undo that. I forgot to hit record. Make sure that you hit record again when you're done with the animation. And it doesn't look like it saved that turning off of the camera. Oh, it did. Okay, I'm looking at the second camera, that's why. Okay, so I'll start off with the second camera. For this one, I want to do the same thing with the camera components. So I'm going to hit record. I'm going to select the second cam. I want to make sure this first camera is turned off. Okay. Okay, so starting off with the second cam, I want the camera component to be turned off. So we're doing the complete opposite of our first camera. Turn that off. We have a keyframe there for that. And let's also actually include a different position. So I'm in the scene view here, and I'm just going to move the camera behind him. We'll start off with right here. So once again, I'm going to select that second cam, go to Game Object, Align with View, and then we can adjust this further if we need to. But now we have a keyframe for both the position and the camera being turned off. So right where that second camera turns off, I believe it's here. I'm going to turn on that second camera. And it's not allowing me to, not sure why. Okay, it's not allowing me to scrub through this now for some reason. Okay, there we go. Okay, so it did take. I'm trying to select the camera to make sure it's turning on. I hit record. Okay, so it's turned off there, turns on there, and I need to move it up a bit. So I'm going to scroll in. And I set a position for that first camera, or that second camera, I should say, kind of right behind him like this. So we can see the camera preview here. Okay, so I think that's good right there. We'll scroll out again. And that second animation is going to play. And I also want to add in one more keyframe at the very end of the camera kind of just being pulled in slightly. So this is going to be a very subtle animation for the movement inward. So I'm just going to manually move this into place. Just move it in slightly. Yeah, so it's a very subtle animation at the very end. And then right at the very end as well, we're also going to turn this back off because then we're going to utilize the camera of our main player. So let me make sure that this is at the exact same spot as that keyframe. And then I'll turn off the camera component again. And then I'm also going to add in a activation track for the entire camera group, because once we're done with this timeline sequence, we can then just turn off this entire group, so we're not having any kind of issues with cameras later on. So I'm going to add in a activation group. Let's go and turn off our animation for that, or the recording of the animation for that. So the activation track will be for the entire camera group. I'll turn this guy on just to make sure we don't run into issues later on. Okay, let me scrub back to the very beginning. Okay, so we want to make this active for the entire sequence. And then after that, we want to turn this off. So you can see we see it says active. This means that those cameras are going to be active the entire time. So how do we turn these off after that has finished playing? Well, if we left click on the track itself, here we have the post playback state. We can check this to say inactive. Okay, so after this is done, if we take a look at the hierarchy, we should see the camera group turn off after we're outside of this active area. Okay, so let's give this a quick test. We'll hit play. Now these camera cuts are going to be a bit rough. We're just kind of transitioning from one camera to the other without having any kind of like fading in or anything of that sort. This is something that we'll be taking a look at more in depth when we take a look at something like Cinemachine, which will allow us to get a bit more control over the cameras. But for now, we're just going with very rough cuts of our camera. So everything seems to be working as intended. Now let's take a look at how we can script this so that after this finishes playing, we can then play as our actual character. So I'm going to add in a new script. We're going to recreate this from scratch. And for this first timeline, if we take a look at it, it's currently set to play on awake. So we're going to leave that as is, but we're going to have it set up so that once it's finished playing, we're then going to play as our character, and we'll do that with a script that determines when this timeline has finished playing, or when it's paused. So let's go into our timeline event scripts folder. I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'll just call this timeline end. I'm going to turn off Unity real quick. I'm going to start up with mono develop. Wait for it to load up. Okay, I need to move my camera to the other side. Okay, so at the very top, we need to include a new namespace using Unity Engine.playables. Okay, this is going to allow us to access our playable director. So we need to include a reference to that. We're going to have a public playable director. And we'll just call this director. Okay, now when this is, we're going to be using this to determine when the timeline has paused. So once that timeline has finished, we're going to go into a pause state. Now we can get that state from the director itself, but we also want to be able to do something with that information. So we're going to include a public bool. We'll call this is playing. Let's call it that. And we also want to reference to the script that we're going to be using to control our player. So that script is, we're going to take a look at it real quick. The script that we're going to be using on our player is called simple controller. and I'll just call this player control. And all we're going to be doing with this is we're going to be turning it on or off depending on whether we're playing a timeline or not. In our start method, we're going to grab our director, the playable director. So we'll say director equals, and we're going to manually assign this. So I'm going to say director dot get component playable director. And then for the simple controller, we will get this as well. We don't really need to get it. We don't need to get the component like this. But since we're not going to manually assign it, we could just grab it automatically from the start method. So we can say player control equals. This is going to be on the object that has the player control. So get components, player control. And this will just allow us to automatically assign this. Add a uppercase P there. Oh, simple control. Getting distracted here. Okay, so we're automatically going to assign our player control based off the simple controller component. I'll leave this public for now, but we don't really need it to be public. We just want to make sure that this is being assigned through the script. Now, in the update method, what I want to do is I want to have a debug.log. And here we're going to say director.state. And we're going to be able to see the state of the director. So it's going to be either paused, play, or delayed. And we're going to use this information to toggle the is playing bool. And then we're going to use that to determine whether or not this is going to be enabled. So I'm going to say if director dot state equals, and here we have play state. This is an enum. Play state dot, and here we have delayed, pause, or playing. In this case, if it's set to pause, that means it has finished. So I'm going to select that. If it is set to paused, then I'm going to have a debug.log that says we are paused. And we'll see all these messages appear in the console. We are paused, and then I'm also going to be enabling the player control. So I'm going to say is playing equals true. And then outside of this if statement, I'm just going to say player control dot enabled equals is playing. So what we're doing here is we're saying whatever our bool is, that's going to determine whether or not it's enabled. So if is playing is true, then we're going to enable that game object, or that component rather. If it's not true, meaning it's false, then this is not going to be enabled. We cannot move around. Okay, so that's all we need. We're just checking to see the state of the director. And if it's paused, then we can start playing as our character. Okay, wait for that to finish. Now I'm going to add this script to, I'm going to switch back to Unity now. I'm going to add that script to the player. So timeline end. I'm going to uncheck the simple controller manually. Okay, we have the director that we need to assign. So that's going to come from our timeline start. If you remember, this has the playable director. So we're going to add that to our script. Is playing is unchecked by default. Player control, it should automatically grab this component for us, but we should see it appear in here whether or not it actually does or doesn't. All right, so let's give this a quick test. Let's see if this works as intended. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that we uncheck maximize on play. That way we can see all this working. Okay, so our simple controller was assigned. So that's working as intended. And it looks like there was a brief moment where the first camera and the second camera were both turned off, so I may need to adjust that. Okay, and we can move around, but I forgot to turn on the camera for the player itself. So before we play this again, I'm going to turn this on. We'll go back into our timeline start and make sure that those cameras are lining up. So when one turns off, the other one is turning on. So I'm going to open up the camera group. So the first cam should be turning off. Let's see. Right about here, turns off. Yep. Transitions into the second camera. Seems to be working as intended. I'll give this a quick preview here again. Okay, so we're standing up. Okay, so it does look like it's working fine from the timeline. Okay. So let's give this another quick test. I'm going to play this in maximize on play mode. Okay, so we're standing up. Oh, and let's see, I forgot what else I need to do. There's something else that needs to be turned off. Okay, so that first camera is working. The second camera is off. I don't know why it's showing that camera. Okay, and now we can move around. That's interesting. I don't know why it's allowing this second camera to be enabled at the very beginning. If we take a look at the cam group here, it should be working just fine. Oh, that second camera needs to be disabled from the start. I'm going to select this real quick and hit record so we can see if this is actually being turned off at the beginning, and it is. Then it turns on. Take a look at the other camera. So this is on from the start. Turns off there. So I think our player camera is the one that's actually interacting with it. When I tested this out before, it didn't have an issue with that camera being on. So there is a quick fix. I'm just going to add an activation track for that camera. This is one of those kind of weird quirks that we have with the timeline where sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to add this in as an active track at the very end of the sequence. And this is automatically set to leave as is. So it's going to stay active after that post playback state. I'll just have these kind of slightly overlapping a bit. That'll be fine right there. Okay, let's give this another quick test. Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. You can see that it started off as we expected. The camera cuts are a bit rough, like I mentioned before, but it works as intended. Now let's go over how we can add in our trigger zone for this second timeline sequence. So I'm going to get out of play mode. We're done with this sequence. Now we want to create a new sequence. So I'm going to create a new sequence, right click, create empty, and this will be timeline trigger. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to be animating our robot character here. All we're going to be doing with this character is we're going to have him walking down about halfway down this corridor. And then we're also going to have some audio clips of him like hitting the ground with his feet, kind of like a metal footstep type sound as he's going down this hallway. And then he's going to stop right about here and go into an idle animation state. We're not going to be controlling any cameras with this one. It's just going to be a very simple animation event, if you will. So let's go and create our component for this. I'll call this timeline trigger. And I'm just going to save this. I forgot to save it in the start folder here. And for this guy, I'm going to select my robot character, press F to zoom in on him. With this guy, we don't have root motion animations for him. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to physically move him through animation myself. So I'm going to have him move from this point right here down to where I want him to move, right about halfway, which is, I believe, right here. It doesn't really matter. I guess right about here will be fine, but I'm physically going to move him with animations down to that position. I'm going to go ahead and move my camera over to the other side, just in case I block something over there. Okay, so I'm going to select my timeline trigger. I don't need this animation track, so I can delete it. I'm going to add a new animation track, which is going to be for our robot character. Now, the robot character already has an animator component applied, so I can just drag this into the timeline. Now, like I mentioned before, I'm also going to manually animate this guy. So I'm going to add in a second animation track. And this is also going to be our robot character. But for this, we're just going to have him moving from one point to another. So we're just going to have a couple of keyframes for this. For this top layer, we're going to be using animations of him walking. So let's go into our models folder, robot. And I'll just select this so we can preview it. So these are the animations that come with this robot character. I'm going to be using this, where is it? The walk cycle baked. Okay, and this is a looping animation. We have it set to loop time and loop pose. So that's the only animation we're going to be using. I wanted to do something else with this robot character where we were in a different room and then this character right here would go into this crawling animation, things of that sort. But I ran into a number of different issues trying to get that to work. I couldn't get this character to rotate properly. It would keep giving me errors. So I just went with something a bit simpler like this. So I'm going to go ahead and move this guy down this way with the animation. But before we do that, let's add in our walk cycle. So if I scrub through this, you can see he is just walking in place. And it's going to be a little bit tricky to get the speed of the animation working properly in regards to how far he moves down this hallway. So I'm going to click on record. For the first keyframe, I'm just going to move him slightly forward just to add that first keyframe. Okay, so we're starting off right there. And then we're going to go all the way down here. And I believe last time, once again, I'll change this to seconds. I believe last time that I did this, I went all the way down to 10 seconds. So I'll do that here as well. So at the 10-second mark, I'm going to move him right here. Okay, that may be a little bit fast for a walk cycle. We'll give it a try. So I'm done with that. That's all we're going to do for that animation. So we just have the 2 keyframes. And now what I want to do is actually just stretch this out. Okay, so this should loop the animation. We got a closer view of him here. And that seems to work pretty good for the most part. So right at the very end, we then want to go into an idle animation state. So we're going to blend between our walking state and our idle state. So once again, let's take a look at this. we have an idle state for him, which is him just holding his rifle in place. So we'll drag this in as well. And remember, we want to blend between these two, so we're going to drag and push these together. And I'll probably have about, I don't know, 30 frames in there where we're going to be blending. Maybe a little bit more, just so it doesn't look like he's sliding in place at the very end. Or maybe I'll pull this out a bit more. Yeah, I'll just keep pulling this out a bit more and then just blend this in really well. Or maybe go the opposite way, because he's still walking as he gets to that point. Yeah, I think that'll be fine. I mean, there's some very, very subtle movement at the very end, but that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to preview this. He's walking down this corridor. And he's going to stop right there and then go into his idle animation. Now, as that's happening, I also want to have some footstep sounds being played as well. So for this, we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need an audio source and some audio clips. So I do have the audio clips that I want to use. I'm going to add the audio source to the robot character, and then we're going to add that as an audio track. So let's add the audio track first. Okay, it's looking for an audio source. I'll go to the robo and I'll add the audio source to him, since he's the one that's going to be playing the audio clips. So audio source. Okay, I'm not going to assign an audio clip to this. All we need is the audio source component. We're then going to be playing the audio clips by dragging them into the timeline. But before we do anything else, I want to make sure that I make a few adjustments to the settings here. So I do want this to be a 3D audio clip. So right here where it says spatial blend, we'll set this from 2D to 3D. If you set this to 2D, you can hear the same audio clip at the same volume no matter where you're at within the game. But with this set to 3D, it's going to take in distance as a way to determine how loud it's going to be. I'll set the volume quite low. We'll go with 0.15. When I tested this out, I believe that was a good volume for that because it does get a little bit loud with it. And then for the volume roll off, I'm going to set this to linear with a min and max distance of 1. And I believe I went with 100. That might be a bit high still. So you can see how far out that audio goes. I'm going to set this down to 50. Yeah, I'll just start off with that value. And if we need to change it, then we can change it. Okay, so now we can add that to our timeline. So I'm going to drag in the robo into the audio source slot. And now we can add in our audio clip. So I have two different audio clips, not animations, audio. So we have this step metal 1. And I don't know if I can, yeah, that's the first one. This is the second one. So we're going to have these playing back to back over and over again to try to match his animations. So as he steps down, we're going to be playing the metal 1, and as the other foot steps down, we're going to be playing metal 3. So if you drag this in, you can see we have our audio clip here. I'm going to move to the very top here. Let me zoom in on my robot character. So I'm going to press F to zoom in on him. And one of the issues that you're going to find with the timeline in regards to using audio is that you can't preview the audio unless you're actually playing the game, which is kind of a, I don't know, it feels like it's something that's detrimental to actually working with the timeline, especially if you're using a lot of audio. So I can't really check this until I start playing it. But I'm going to add this one in right here. Then I'll add in the second audio clip. And these will be back to back. So we're going to play that first audio clip. And I think that matches fairly well. It's not going to be super precise, but as you can see, it works fine. So as he steps down, that first audio clip plays, then the second audio clip, and so on and so forth. Now, I want this to happen over the length of the entire animation clips. So I'm going to take both of these right here. I'll select both of them, copy them. So Control C. You can also right click and copy them. And then right at the very end, actually if we paste them, it's going to paste them right after the audio clips in front of it, so I can keep doing this over and over until we get to the very end. And I want this to end. Yeah, that'll be fine right there. So I want this to end right as he transitions into that second animation state. Okay, I want to see how this sounds and looks. So I need to make sure that I turn off the original timeline, or rather just have this turned off so it doesn't start right away. And this one is already set to play on awake, so this should start up right away. I'll just keep this one fairly large. Let me zoom out a bit here. Okay, there we go. He stops. Now he's in the idle state. Now, as you can see from the game view, it's kind of hard to see, but I can actually move around and I can actually hear the footsteps from my camera because it's based off the distance. The audio clip is a little bit loud, but it is working as intended. Now we need to create the trigger zone to start this. So we have that second animation sequence ready to go. Now right here, when this player is active and we start moving around in our environments, I want to trigger that second sequence to start when we enter this area over here. So first off, let's go back to our timeline start. I'm going to have this set to play on awake, but the second one is not going to play on awake. Instead, we're going to be using our trigger. We're going to be using an on-trigger enter method to then call this timeline to be played. So it's going to do that now. We'll create a script for it first. So I'm just going to create a script in here. We'll call this timeline trigger. Open this up in Model Develop. Yeah, actually, this level itself, Omar, was actually, I had to rebake the lighting. I've been experimenting a lot with like linear and gamma color spaces with Unity, and I found that linear was really nice to use for this type of environment, so I went with that. I've also experimented with like deferred and forward lighting and stuff like that, so I had to rebake the lighting. It actually took me about an hour, but it looks a lot better, I think. Okay, so let's take a look, and it didn't actually open the script that I wanted. Okay, so this is the timeline trigger. Once again, just like our timeline end, we need a reference to our playable. So Unity engine dot playables. And we'll do that because we need our director. So public playables director, or playable director. I'll call this director as well. And in our start method, we're going to say director equals director.getComponent playable director Okay, so we have our playable director. We're not using update this time. All we're going to do is use an on-trigger enter method. This will allow us to determine whether or not we've entered the trigger zone, and then we can do something with that. So we're going to say void on-trigger enter collider col. And within here, we're going to be checking for a tag. So we're going to say if col dot compare tag, and we're looking for a tag of player. And what we're doing here is we're checking to see if something has entered our trigger zone, and if so, does it have a tag of player? If so, we can then do something else, and in this case, we're going to play our timeline. So we're going to say director dot play. And that's all we need to do in here. So once our player has entered that trigger zone, we're then going to play that timeline for the robot moving around. So pretty simple overall. I'll go ahead and save this out. We'll jump back into Unity. Okay, we need to create the trigger. So for this, I'm just going to create a cube, a fairly large cube that we're going to be placing right here. And we're going to set its collider to a trigger. So we'll go to Game Object, Cube. And for this, I want to make this fairly large because I don't want to be able to actually see the robot just standing there when I enter this area. So I want to make this so that he enters the trigger zone before he even gets a chance to actually see that robot. So we're going to make this fairly large. Okay, I think that's big enough. Yeah, that should be fine right there. Okay, I'm going to turn off the mesh renderer. We don't need that. And for the box collider on here, in order to actually use this as a trigger, we need to make sure that isTrigger is enabled. Now, lastly, we're going to be checking for a tag on our player. So let's select the player. And he has the tag of player already selected, but by default, it's going to be set to untagged. So I have this set up with a player tag already. And now we have everything that we need. So if everything is good to go, actually, we need to apply that trigger script that we just created. So timeline trigger. And I'll rename this to trigger zone. And I want to assign the playable director, which is the timeline trigger. Okay, I just want to test to see if this trigger is working before we go through the entire process again. So I'm going to disable the first timeline start. So I'm going to turn off play on awake for that. The player should be enabled by the start. So let's enable the simple controller. I'll turn off the timeline end. And I believe we have everything ready to go. The second timeline here should not have play on awake checked on. So everything's good to go. Let's give this a quick test. I'll hit play. Okay, so I'm walking around. I'm going to enter that trigger zone. And there we go. We've started the second sequence. And now we see our robot character moving forward with the audio clips playing as well. Okay, so now we know this second timeline works. Let's start this from the very beginning. So on the first timeline, we'll set play on awake checked on. I'll go down to my player. I'll turn on the timeline end script and turn off the simple controller. And that should be all we need. So let's give this a quick test. Okay, so that's working as intended. Let's actually maximize this. Okay, so there's our first camera, our second camera. Okay, and there we go. We're in our playable state now. Walk into the trigger zone. And there we go. The robot is now moving forward with animations and the audio. All right, so that's just about it. That's all I want to cover today. As you can see, it is a very simple process, but it does take up a lot of time to just get right. Just having animations and things of that sort, getting those right and synced up and all that kind of stuff takes a long time. So I do recommend just playing around with the timeline. It does have a few quirks. I did notice that I had issues with certain types of characters. Sometimes it would move them to certain positions, or sometimes animations would not play as expected. Other times there would be issues where maybe a camera would turn off or some other camera would not be enabled, things of that sort. So there were a lot of weird quirks with the timeline. So it did take a long time to actually figure out all these different issues and workarounds. But overall, it is a very fun tool to be able to create things like this. Hopefully this helped you to understand how we can go from cutscene to a playable part and then back to a cutscene, different types of cutscenes where we can trigger a cutscene or we can start off with one. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the chat. I'll try my best to explain them as best as possible. or if you have any questions about Unity. Otherwise, we're going to call it a day on this stream. So Andrew asked if this will be available for later viewing. Yes, it will be. All our live events are usually archived and then they're recorded so that if you do miss a live stream or if you need to watch something again, you'll have it available in a recorded format. So this will probably be available in an archived format later today, as long as everything goes well with the actual recording of the video and we don't need to make any kind of major changes to the actual video itself. Okay, so if we don't have any other questions, I'm gonna call this quits for this live stream. Hope you guys learned a little bit about how to use the timeline with different types of animations and scripting. In our next live stream, we're gonna be going more in depth with Cinemachine, which is mostly used for creating more cinematic events, but that will be probably a good project for creating more film-like events within Unity. So we'll be using Cinemachine. We'll probably also use scripting if needed. And then we're also obviously going to be using the timelines along with that. So I appreciate you guys for coming to this live stream. If you guys have any requests or anything of that sort, make sure to let me know. Also check out the community if you haven't already. Thank you guys. See you guys later.